Welcome to Dig, a history podcast.
Trees live. Some even get sick and die. Some are cut down in the prime of their lives by storms, beavers, or humans. If you stand alone in the middle of a forest, you can almost hear them talk to each other. In the rustle of the leaves, the creak and groan of the wood, the nuts and fruits dropping to the loamy floor beneath.
Oh man, you weren't holding anything back.
No, I was not. If you're out in the forest, it's almost easy to believe that a tree threatened might fight back. In Japan, recognizing the spirit of inanimate things, from trees to mountains to interestingly shaped rocks, is part of Shinto. Older than writing in Japan, Shinto is the root of Japanese values and ways of thinking. Shinto is why the concepts of purity and impurity govern daily life in the simple acts of gargling, hand washing, and removing shoes upon entry to a home. Shinto grounds the rites of passage in an individual's life, like blessing children at ages 3, 5, and 7, and all birthday milestones, 14 or 15, 20, 60, 70, and 88 thereafter. Many of the major festivals still celebrated in Japan are Shinto, and the practice of opening ceremonies, annually opening hiking trails, annually opening the sea, or the purification of new buildings, are also Shinto. And of course, the centrality of nature in art and literature are Shinto. The pervasiveness of Shinto is fascinating, and that's what today's story is about. In the 1970s, the Japanese government wanted to cut down a 700-year-old tree to build a train station. But that tree didn't want to be cut down, and according to local legend, it got its way. Is this a case of tree wraiths cursing people? Is it the inherent environmentalism of Shinto and by extension Japanese culture? Or is it something entirely inexplicable? I'm Avril Earls.
And I'm Sarah Hanley Cousins.
And we're your historians for this episode of Dig.
In a heavily forested, temperate, mountainous, and volcanically active archipelago like Japan, it is not particularly surprising that the people living there would develop an early animistic religion. When the very earth moves hundreds of times a year, and you don't have any Geiger counters to understand why, the spirit of all things seems as good an explanation as any. But this is certainly not unique to Japan. Animistic religions, assigning divine or spiritual entities to elements of nature, are the earliest religions all over the world, reflecting humans trying to make sense of their environment.
Shinto, which means way of the gods, was a term first used in the 6th century of the Common Era. What we know about early Shinto is that it was generally practiced in one of two ways. Ujigami was based on the extended family shrine and revolved around ancestor worship. This emerged largely from clan-based kinship networks in early Japan and emphasized filial piety and hierarchies within the family. Hinagami Shinto was based on relationships of individual priest figures to specific kami. Kami as a concept encompasses a range of spirits and divinities. One's ancestors are kami, but there might be kami in a gnarled old tree, a weirdly formed rock, the peal of thunder, a gurgling stream, or even a scurrying rat. And while there might be divinities in all kinds of natural phenomena, there were also a few discernible kami who resembled Western gods. Amaterasu?
Amaterasu, the sun goddess, is particularly important in the Japanese pantheon, and in a way represents the merging of the different facets or manifestations of Shinto. She is the kami of the all-powerful sun, but she is also worshipped by the imperial family as their ancestor. This was written down in the 7th century, when the imperial family wanted to solidify their claim to authority through divine right. Prince Shotoku, who ordered the recording of Japanese history and his family's divine right to rule, also described the major religions of Japan as a tree, in which Shinto is the roots of the tree, embedded in the very heart of the Japanese people, Confucianism is the trunk and the branches, providing politics, morality, and education. And Buddhism is the flowers, where religious feelings bloom.
Confucianism and Buddhism, of course, came to Japan from the West. Shotoku was largely responsible for spreading Buddhism in Japan in the 7th century. But when the imperial family embraced Shinto, ultimately making it the imperial faith, it began to be standardized in a way that animistic religions elsewhere usually are not.
Right, yeah, that's interesting. Shinto tends to move in and out of the foreground of Japanese worship practices in a sort of dance with Buddhism. Sometimes they share the spotlight. Sometimes one is more prominent than the other, depending on who is in power in the Japanese government. Imperial family versus shoguns versus fascists. Shinto doesn't have a Siddhartha Gautama to give it a central doctrine, and other than believing that ancestors are spirits who live among us, it doesn't give much direction for morality or afterlife questions. It's more concerned with this worldly stuff, stemming from its earliest manifestations as a system of asking for blessings and good luck, rather than asking for forgiveness for wrongdoing. Because of the lack of central doctrinality and the focus of this worldly stuff, some scholars don't even think of Shinto as a religion. It's more a way of thinking and living, and possibly more useful as a way to understand Japanese-ness. Jason Josephson, for instance, has explored this specifically in the context of the adoption of Shinto as a state ideology during the Meiji period, starting in 1868.
And take note that Sarah has said state ideology rather than state religion, which is usually how Shinto is discussed within the Meiji period. Historian Jason Josephson argues that the Meiji state defined religion as private, and in theory, everyone was allowed to practice whatever religion they wanted on their own time. Shinto, on the other hand, was the public, de-Buddhistified, mandatory rituals that, by extension of the Meiji modernization and ideology, were effectively secular in theory and practice.
And the Meiji period is really where we can bring our tree story to fruition. Ooh, that was clever there. For one thing, Shinto was co-opted by the Meiji emperor, who had wrested control of Japan from the Tokugawa shogunate. The forward-thinking emperor established a parliament to create a new ruling class of people and launched Japan on a rapid industrialization and westernization path. Pretty much everything about Japanese life changed in some way. The very way that Japanese men dressed shifted to the Western-style three-piece suit, replacing the traditional kimonos in public life. Everyone go read The Clockmaker of Filigree Street, which is about...
Watchmaker, yeah.
The Watchmaker of Filigree Street, which is sort of about this time period,
yes,
right? That
yes.
It's set, because I remember the fact that he dresses in a suit. What's his name?
Now that you said that, I can't think of it. I kind of think of Katsu the
octopus. But either way, apologies to the author, who I am definitely going to tag on Twitter. But there's a big deal about him wearing a suit, right? And people are like surprised to see this very handsome Japanese man wearing a three-piece suit,
right?
Anyway, okay, coming back around. Sorry, I got distracted.
Yeah.
That's like my favorite book ever.
That's
all right.
Good.
Shinto, as the traditional faith of the imperial family, was essential to the ritualistic worship of the emperor and his family. Buddhism had been the religion of the shogunates. In the last decades of the 19th century, Emperor Meiji phased out Buddhism in the public realm. From then on, the nation stood with Japan's leaders in the Shinto opening of the sea ceremony, witnessed the tearing down and rebuilding of the shrine at Isa? Mm-hmm. The tearing down and rebuilding of the shrine at Isa every 20 years, and embraced the Japanese-ness of daily and annual rituals of Shinto. State Shinto was purposeful and powerful, and its reassertion as the Japanese religion undoubtedly ushered in a return to those nature-focused sentiments.
In addition, under the Meiji emperor, who ruled until his death in 1912, Japan underwent rapid industrialization. Just as in the UK and America, industrialization was disastrous to the Japanese environment. Air pollution from factories and energy production facilities, clear-cutting forests for increased agricultural output, and mining were all detrimental and necessary to Japanese modernization. But the Japanese were also able to pick and choose European and American industrial practices, technologies, and sciences. A more enfranchised populace protested the environmental deterioration. In 1900, for example, when deforestation around a copper mine allowed frequent flooding to poison farmers' fields and families, 2,000 of them marched in protest on Tokyo. Government officials in the Meiji period, so that's 1868 to 1912, and the Taisho period, that's 1912 to 1926, were more likely to bend to these kinds of overt public pressures. Ultimately, clear-cutting of forests was stopped in Meiji Japan, and 70% of Japan remains forested as a result.
Scholars like Brendan Barrett continually point back to the influence of Shinto to explain this environmental consciousness. While farmers getting sick off copper solvents in the floodplains probably had more self-preservation on their minds than environmentalism, the Meiji period... Meiji?
Mm-hmm.
Meiji?
Mm-hmm. Meiji.
Okay. The Meiji period also saw a resurgence of nature and environment themes in art and literature. Like most Shinto-grounded thought, this movement focused on humanity's oneness with nature. We are not greater or above our physical environment, and by extension, we must protect it. Perhaps this sentiment is the heart of the consciousness that Barrett argues permeated Japan, moving communities to protest actions they saw as harmful.
In Nayagawa, a suburb of Osaka, Japan, a 700-year-old kusunoki tree twists out of the ground, standing some 65 feet tall at its highest. A tree native to the region, as well as southern China, Korea, and Vietnam, the kusunoki, or camphor in English, blooms with little white flowers in the spring among bright green leaves. The leaves smell most strongly of camphor, that sort of heady, aromatic undertone of pretty much everything from embalming fluid to mint and rosemary.
Yeah, it's very pungent.
Very pungent.
Yeah.
Camphors, like this one, are often made up of multiple tree stems, splitting off from the same root system and stretching wide and tall. For generations, the Nayagawa tree, called the Big Kusu tree of Kayashima by the locals, grew tall and sprawling, and people respected it for its grandness. In 1910, the Japanese government built a train station next to the tree, and those waiting for a locomotive ride into Osaka could enjoy the shade of the big tree.
So a side note, by the time Big Kusu enters the historical record, Japan was basically a parliamentary democracy. Shinto was the state religion. The country had undergone a rapid industrialization, and things like trains were common and widespread. Like many of the new democracies in the early 20th century, however, the Taisho government was unstable and fell fairly quickly to fascist elements, and the Showa period started. In the pre-1945 period, the Showa emperor was worshipped as a living god, and the military ran the authoritarian government. These were the folks who invaded China in 1937 and sent bombers into Pearl Harbor in 1941. After Japan's defeat in 1945, didn't the Japanese invade Manchuria earlier than that too? 1931?
Yeah, I think so.
That's beside the point. After Japan's defeat in 1945, prefaced by the atomic bombs that the Americans dropped on Hiroshima and Nagasaki, killing hundreds of thousands and creating disastrous ecological effects, not to mention kicking off, a world at war for the rest of that century and into today, Japan was occupied by the Allied forces, who excised state religion, returned Japan to a democracy, and demoted the emperor god down to a constitutional monarch. The Showa emperor lived and ruled until 1989.
When he died.
Wow.
In early post-war Japan, many Shinto shrines were taken down to make way for roads and buildings. Japan recovered economically quite rapidly, sort of akin to the economic miracle in Western Europe after the war, and became one of the fastest growing economies in the world, second only to the United States until the 1990s, when it was surpassed by China and entered a period of stagnation. According to Aiki Rotz, Shinto made a resurgence in the 1970s, 80s, and 90s, reforming as what Rotz calls a Shinto environmentalist paradigm, which drew on the connections between Shinto shrines, rituals, and nature. And that the proponents of Shinto environmentalism emphasized an ancient ecological knowledge which instructed the Japanese how to live in harmony with nature. The ancient knowledge claims are perhaps exaggerated, and that's sort of what Rotz is suggesting. But the emergence of this paradigm in post-war Japan is important to consider, particularly with regard to our big kusu tree, but also Japanese culture and environmentalist practices more broadly.
In 1972, the local government of Neyagawa wanted to build a new, larger train platform to accommodate the traffic going in and out of Osaka during the Kayashima stop. Through the Kayashima stop. Neyagawa was a burgeoning suburb, and the 1910 platform simply was not meeting the demands of commuters using the train. They announced their intentions to build the multi-level platform, which would include cutting down Big Kusu, which was exactly in the middle of where the planned platform would stand.
The people of Neyagawa, and Big Kusu itself, according to local legends, were not happy. A kami resided in Big Kusu, and when threatened, the kami resisted. There were rumors that a white snake, a symbol of the Shinto deities, had been seen slithering around the trunk of the tree. A man who tried to cut off a limb developed hay fever.
Oh my god.
Dun, dun, dun.
He got seasonal allergies.
And residents reported seeing smoke rising from the tree. Some accounts said it from its roots, others said from its top. The locals were all worked up and pressed their government officials until they agreed not to cut down the tree. Instead, though considerably more costly than the original design, the platform was built around the tree. Construction began in 1973 and finished in 1980. It included a rectangular open in the ceiling of the platform.
Opening.
What did I say?
Open.
It included a rectangular opening in the ceiling of the platform, which allowed the tree to continue to grow upward and outward.
Today, Big Kusu, still inside the train platform, is properly surrounded by a Shinto shrine. You probably already have some idea of what a Shinto shrine looks like, but we'll post a few examples on the blog when we post the show notes for this episode. That is if I remember to do the images. No, I'm just kidding. The entrance is flanked by the torii, which is basically a gate. The torii are usually the most recognizable elements of a shrine. These are the red beams that look like an H with a hat sitting on top.
It's the best way I could think to describe it.
That's so cute. It's the hat part that makes me laugh. Okay. The elements making up the rest of the site vary. Sometimes the stairs behind the torii lead to a pretty elaborate compound of buildings serving the needs of worshippers and kami alike, including an administrative building, a honden or building that would enshrine the kami, the lion guard statues that protect the space, a hand washing station, and more. Sometimes shrines are much simpler, consisting of a torii and nothing more. But most have structures of some kind, in part because of the influence of Buddhism on Shinto after the 7th century.
And that's just because Buddhism requires some sort of space for meditation. So they were usually next door to each other, and it wasn't until the Meiji period that the intentionality of Shinto shrines being built was separated from Buddhist shrines.
Got it.
Temples. So Big Kusu Shrine is not particularly special. There are about 80,000 shrines in Japan today, and they can be large, small, or even portable. The shrine at Ise, which houses the imperial family's kami, the sun goddess Amaterasu, is ritually taken down and rebuilt every 20 years.
Yeah, it's really cool to see it.
They've been doing this since 4 BCE.
It's nuts.
It's like, this is amazing. 2,000 years. 2,100 years? Wait, what year is it right now?
2018.
2018. 2,000 years. But there aren't many reminders in the urban parts of Japan that there might be something greater than the consumerist, modern, industrial world that Japan has created for itself. A Shinto shrine inside a commuter train platform surrounding a 700-year-old tree might be the exception.
Yeah, they're kind of forced to see it.
Yeah.
Currently, despite a population of 127 million, with most people living in areas with over 5,000 people per square kilometer, which is not a real thing. Like, damn you and your whatever it's called.
Metric system.
Thank you, metric system. See, I hate it so much I just put it out of my brain. About 12% of Japan is protected parkland. By comparison, the United States, which is many, many times the size of Japan in terms of landmass, but only a little more than double the population, only has about 14% of land designated as protected parkland. In the United Kingdom, more comparable as another island nation with a highly dense population, only has 7% of its land protected by a national park system.
So obviously you don't need a pervasive religious inclination to have a respect for nature and the environment. National parks were created by countries all over the world in the 19th and early 20th century. Conservation and environmental protection legislation was passed in most industrial nations in the 1960s, 70s, and 80s, and earlier in some places, particularly like England, where the pollution was earliest and worst. In response to the truly horrific effects of a century of coal burning, chemical waste dumping, and landfill creation over the previous 2 centuries. And certainly the Japanese, both before and after industrialization, are not the epitome of an environmentally friendly and conscious people. Anthropologist Peter Kirby illustrates some of the more blatant scenes of Japanese disregard for the environment in 4 vignettes that are too good not to just quote here and now.
Right. So, during a routine safety check at a Tokyo community pool, 3 Japanese swimmers, 2 women and 1 man, all in their late 20s, sit on the pool edge and confess their discomfort with the fact that the pool water is heated by recycled energy from a major waste incinerator complex, in the middle of which the pool lies, whose enormous smokestack looms hundreds of feet above the swimming area. The community has been bombarded for months by media reports regarding the dangers of toxic pollution from incinerators in Japan.
At a marina, I just touched your toes with my toes. At a marina along the coastline, tossed cans, plastic bottles, and other flotsam bob in the crevices of massive concrete tetrapods that create a breakwater there. On the long path to the parking lot, a middle-aged Japanese man, finding a pile of waste abandoned by yachters and others — public trash cans are extremely scarce in Japan — pulls out a lighter and starts burning the heaps of plastic bags, food wrappers, styrofoam trays, and leftover food garbage to protect against vermin, thereby creating a plume of acrid smoke that soon envelops the jetty.
No. 4 men tee off at a golf course on an artificial island in Tokyo Bay. Despite their good-natured grumblings, the men are forbidden to smoke on the course due to highly flammable gases wafting up through vents from the millions of tons of waste decomposing beneath the manicured fairways. In the distance on all sides, the expansive bayscape surrounding them is filled with similar islands made of garbage, an inland sea of wastelands that provide valuable real estate for infrastructure and development.
Yep. As befits the land of the rising sun, the acme, is that how you say that? Mm-hmm. The acme of Mount Fuji in summer is packed with hundreds of hikers huddled against the bitter cold and high winds at 12,388 feet to view the sunrise, the first moment the sun touches Japan. And of course, the real name of Japan is Nippon, which means land of the rising sun. Mm-hmm. Though Mount Fuji is regarded as a sacred peak and holds unparalleled significance in Japanese culture, the surface of the mountaintop is encrusted with drink cans, energy tonic ampules, empty water bottles, wrappers, and other detritus dropped by exhausted climbers who squeeze between the improbable noodle shops, vending machines, and souvenir stalls that crowd the summit. As the dense stream of bodies, 4 or so abreast, shoulder to shoulder, trudge up the main trail, more climbers are able to reach the peak's volcanic summit and consume its amenities, while returning hikers spill down the various descents like human lava.